we can find ways to encourage people to listen, that can help them to build a connection to the, even if it's to a small plot of land near them, but helping them to have a new relationship with that, which will then expand and help, hopefully, to have a deeper and more meaningful relationship with our natural world. And small steps like that, even if it's only a couple of people at a time, that could spread. And I think that, no one person is going to be able to change the world, but that doesn't mean we should give up.
Another episode of the Conscient podcast. I'm with Annie Mahtani from the UK. Welcome, Annie.
Thank you, Claude. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you, because we first met in Dieburg, Germany, about 3 years ago at an event celebrating the 25 years of the World's Forum for Acoustic Ecology. And I've been following your work, and I had the pleasure of being part of your festival that you organized this year in Birmingham, where I did a workshop. We'll talk about all of those things, but I'd like you to introduce yourself, talk about where you're from, what you do, and then we'll get into the topic of reality. So please.
Okay, thank you. So I'm Annie, and I'm from Birmingham in the UK. I'm a composer, grounded in electroacoustic music and practice. And I'm based at the University of Birmingham, where I am co-director of BEAST, Birmingham Electroacoustic Sound Theatre. And I also co-direct another organisation called Sound Kitchen. And across both these organisations represent a lot of my work, from composing acoustic music all the way to the other side of my work, which is working with environmental sound, and particularly in sound walking. So with Sound Kitchen, the main practice we do there now is developing and devising sound walks. Compositionally, my work more so these days features environmental sound as the core of it. So I do quite a lot of field recording, and have done over the last years, both locally and everywhere I travel as well. And that often drives my music at the moment, and my practice and my wider practice of listening.
Well, let's start with the topic of reality and accepting reality. I think you've had a chance to listen to some of the episode. What comes to mind when around the idea and theme of reality for you? Writer Rebecca Solnit. Hope locates itself in the premises that we don't know what will happen, and that in the spaciousness of uncertainty is room to act.
Yeah, the podcast that you created, Claude, was really interesting and very thought-provoking as well, and it articulated a lot of thoughts and issues around reality and where we are now, that in ways that maybe I haven't thought of before. One of the things that really resonated with me when I was listening to it was the reality of uncertainty at the moment. And I feel like the world that we live in, particularly today, and with this, I felt the uncertainty before we were in a pandemic, with the concern of climate change and the politics of world politics and what was happening, and that became even more pronounced, obviously, when we were faced with a pandemic and everything we knew was thrown up in the air. But I wrote down a quote when I was listening, particularly, which is the spaciousness of uncertainty and giving us the room to act. And I think that really resonated with me, because I've witnessed and been part of those acts of being able to do things and explore the reality that we live in now, particularly in this last year. and as painful and worrying and stressful as the uncertainty of our world is now, because of it, there are opportunities. And it's very, very easy to get very dragged down in the negativity of things, but those opportunities are things that can offer us that little bit of hope, which is another thing that was discussing a lot in your podcast. And the hope being an active attitude was really important, because one needs to find some way to deal with our world today, and a way to find that hope and to own it as well, I think.
Journalist Richard Heinberg. Hope is not just an expectation of better times. It is an active attitude, a determination to achieve the best possible outcome, regardless of the challenges one is facing. Well, one of the things I've been exploring is the notion of grief as well, because to me they're interconnected. When you recognize that you're in a grieving process of some kind, you do come out of it somehow, and you do need to counterbalance the grieving. So what are your thoughts on ecological grief?
The term ecological grief is something that I hadn't thought about or even knew it existed until your podcast and the workshop that we might talk about later that we were sitting in together. And when I discovered this term, it made so much sense to me, because there is this ecological grief that so many of us are feeling at the moment, because again, the uncertainty and having so much of this taken out of our hands, and witnessing firsthand how our ecological world is evolving, and we have no control over it at the moment, even though we know that it's the acts of our species that have caused all of this to happen. We're grieving for things that we didn't even know existed sometimes, but we can see are lost. And it just, that term for me, it really helped to realize that actually it's okay to feel this. This is a real thing, and this grief, it's a condition, and it's one that not only I am feeling, but so many people around the world who are feeling this, with this lack of control and this grief of, as we witness, it feels like the world is falling apart around us. So it offers me a little comfort, the term, even though, there's a lot of negativity in that.
Well, we're both electroacoustic composers, you and I, and share a similar background around an interest of soundscape and context and environment, that kind of thing. I was impressed when I saw the call for works of the Beast Fest this year, which is recalibration, because part it's linked to the COVID-19 pandemic and how do we cover and how do we deal, but in acoustic terms, in language that I understand, like I work in. And so I submitted a workshop, but maybe you could talk a bit about the festival. And I think you were the curator, so you conceived, or you worked on developing the approach. And I just want to congratulate you on the tone. One of the things the festival chose to do is to have gender parity in the programming. Things like that really, I think, are important. So maybe just talk a bit about the event, why you created it, and some of the outcomes.
We run an event every year in Birmingham, a festival of electroacoustic music, and 2020's festival, we had to move online very, very quickly due to the pandemic. We had 2 weeks' notice when it was cancelled. I know. 2021, I had already lined up a theme and some artists that were going to come to Birmingham. And that was always going to be around listening, around the environment, and with the wider theme of climate change as well. But things were very uncertain for a long time, and then it became clear that we weren't going to be running an online festival, and that we needed to run. Oh, sorry, we weren't going to be running an in-person festival, and if we were going to do anything, it was going to be online. And part of me felt, I didn't necessarily want what I had planned to be online, because I so desperately wanted to see these people and to have them in a room together. But the other part of me felt that actually there's this topic can be wider, and we can't wait. We can't sit on it. We need to be addressing this. We can't run a festival without having some reference to our world today. And for me, it's in some ways a justification, but also it's stuff that I'm absolutely passionate about as well. And so what 2021 allowed me to do this year was to really broaden what we could present. We weren't going to be putting up a loudspeaker system, so we didn't have any limitations as to music or ideas or presentation methods, other than that it had to be streamed and it had to be online. And we've just had, a year of COVID. We've had a lot of content suddenly coming online. So there was a bit of what I felt was a bit of an oversaturation in some ways. I reached a point when there was so much being offered to us online that it was difficult to be able to figure out what we wanted to listen to anyway. And so all these things sort of fed into how we approached it, and it needed to reference COVID. There was so much happening in the world of listening over the last year, with practice listeners engaging differently with the environment, noticing the small changes that were happening, and unpracticed listeners, people who didn't pay that much attention to the world around us, suddenly find themselves engaging more and with their locality, hearing things suddenly for the first time in their back gardens or in their front gardens or in their streets, and noticing those sonic differences when things were taken out of the mix, like cars, like planes. And there's been lots of people addressing this and talking about this. And for the festival, we wanted to look at the way that listening has changed, the way that practice has changed, what COVID has done to alter and adjust people's practice, the way that composers and practitioners have responded to the pandemic, musically or through listening, and also addressing the wider issues. Sort of, what does it mean going forwards after this year, the year of uncertainty, the year of opportunity for many? What does it mean going forwards to our soundscape, to our own practice, to our environmental practice and listening? We presented that call for words as a series of questions, not expecting necessarily an answers, but a way to address, a way to explore. And that's what the weekend of concerts and talks and workshops was, this kind of exploration of our soundscapes, thinking about change and thinking about our future.
And I'd like to talk a bit about the workshop that you that I gave, but you were there, and there were about 30, 35 participants from around the world, most of the UK, but there were all kinds of people. And I was really pleased to see how it unfolded over time. Like, at first we were talking about greening the arts sector and how we can, reduce travel and touring and those kinds of things, which was really important. But then it got into more philosophical issues and existential issues. And I think a couple of people were traumatized or mildly traumatized by the tenure of the issue, you know, because if you hadn't really thought through the emergency, the climate emergency, it can come as a shock to see how bad things are. And at one point, there was a young person who said, you know, oh, maybe we in the music community all need to start thinking or doing acoustic ecology. And there were moments like that I found really interesting. So what were your thoughts on some of the things that were said at the workshop and some of the highlights for you?
Yeah, well, I mean, that quote was a great one. You know, absolutely, I fully agree there. But you know, what were, you know, interesting things that came out is that, you know, for some people that the solace that they get in listening was really important, and how that you know, listening is such an integral part of how they act, so how they move forwards, so how they write music, and how they make those decisions was very interesting. And as you said, there was some quite some very deep and honest responses as well. There was discussions around capitalism, this kind of feeling that, you know, we've got some of us feel like we have a responsibility in our art to be able to address these in some way or another. And whilst that is seen, you know, as very valid in some ways, that there are the flip side of that is that if capitalism is the thing that's driving us, how are we ever going to have a voice, and how are we ever going to make a difference? And a lot of this this feeling that however hard we try, we can't even have an imprint on change. There was, you know, also it was really it was quite upsetting to see the impact that this is having on younger generations who are living in a world of, I think the word was panic, for one, like constant panic, because they look around and nothing's changing, it's only getting worse, and they can only imagine this world moving forwards and don't know what to do. They just don't know where to start or what to do, and how they then find comfort in that in our world today was very interesting. And I think that for me, you know, these issues have followed me through life. You know, they've always been there, but this for the generation below me, it feels like they're not just there, but they are at the forefront of their worries and their concerns, and even more so because they don't know anything else. And it's incredibly sad and worrying and eye-opening in a lot of ways.
And do you see it coming through their art practice, or maybe they're not there yet? I don't know. Artist David Haley. We now need aesthetics to sensitize us to other ways of life. And we need artists to sensitize us to the shape of things to come.
Yeah, I think that again, some I think it was in this conversation and other conversations I've had, is that kind of like, how do I do this in my art? You know, there is these issues are so big. How can I create a piece of music or a dance or anything that really can reflect them and explain them properly and have an impact? And I think one thing that came out of that workshop was that don't give up. You know, there was one person particularly who was talking about, you know, feeling a bit of despair because they don't they can't have that impact that they want to have, or they don't even see the point because they're not going to reach anybody. And particularly when presenting to the usual audiences, who often, you're preaching to like-minded people. And I think the conversation moved on to that kind of discussion of how actually we can step out of the normal presentation places, step out of the concert hall and find ways to engage with people. And again, often coming back to that active listening, the fact that if we can find ways to encourage people to listen, that can help them to build a connection to the, even if it's to a small plot of land near them, but helping them to have a new relationship with that, which will then expand and help, hopefully, to have a deeper and more meaningful relationship with our natural world. And small steps like that, even if it's only a couple of people at a time, that could spread. And I think that, no one person is going to be able to change the world, but that doesn't mean we should give up.
And the accumulation of efforts throughout artistic communities. I mean, one of the dilemmas is should everybody start making art about climate change? And that's not necessarily going to help. But if people, it might. But if people are aware of where they're at and what they can do, and certainly the topic of listening comes back. Hildegard Westerkamp was one of the first guests on this season, and she just said, you need to slow down, you need to listen.
To allow for time to pass without any action and without any solution, and to just experience. And I think that slowdown is an absolute, if there is any chance to survive, I think that kind of slowing down through listening and meditation and through not doing so much, I think there's some hope in that.
I've been thinking about that the last few days, about panic, and emergency and those active terms, and we have so little time. And ironically, because we have so little time, we have to slow down and listen, because there will be a future. It doesn't look good right now, but the uncertainty is such that the accumulation of efforts and a calming down once we've kind of come to terms with reality, whichever reality we choose to accept, I think there's a lot of hope there, because we are a hopeful species. We have been through difficult times before, and the role of artists is very important. And being a sound artist, and you being a sound artist, I'm really interested in what our peers are. That's one of the reasons I proposed the workshops. What are we doing? And not sort of, just recycling, but what are we thinking about? How are we, and what traditions can we when we call upon that are not necessarily new, but that are rich and deep, that we can have a continuity with? And certainly listening, a culture of listening is one of them. And then if we choose to record, and this is where I like the questions that you asked as a festival, how do we go forward in the recovery from COVID? What choices will we make? For instance, if we're field recording, what are those? Just this week, it was fascinating. Dylan Robinson's written a book called Hungry Listening, and he's an Indigenous scholar here in Canada at Queen's University. And it's a great book, and he's really questioning some of our regular practices, like when we take a sound from the land, what right do we have to capture that sound, or at least what relationship do we have with the sound, with the being, with the event, the sound event, and those are questions that I find important for our communities to consider going forward. You kind of have to rethink everything, including your output as an artist. Anyway, Annie, I'd like to know a bit more about your own practice, because I know I heard a little bit of your work when we were in Germany, and I was really fascinated. So maybe just talk a bit about your work and what connections you see to environmentalism and listening.
as I said at the beginning, my practice is grounded in acoustic and electroacoustic music, and I think I've always found that my work has had some kind of external influence. It's been inspired, whether that's through writings or imagery a lot, but also through place. And I find that I end up writing about place quite a lot. Locations that I've been to or places that mean a lot to me. And so that's a really important part of my work, as is space. I work with large-scale multi-channel systems, so I'm able to work, tangibly and physically with a space of a studio, but with depth and perspective. But that kind of comes together, and I'll talk a little bit about the piece that you mentioned that I've had in Dieburg, which was called Aeolian, and that brought together my practice of time. I think I composed it in around 2015, which was field recording and working in a studio with some elements of sound manipulation as well, and working with multi-channel systems. And for that piece, it was using an experience that I had recording in a valley in Northumberland, where actually the recording conditions weren't quite as I'd hoped, and it was very windy and grey and foreboding in many ways. But I took time in that recording, and the recording experience is so fundamental to my work, that kind of meditative experience of recording and being in a space. And I spent quite a long time sitting and just recording the wind, hence the title Aeolian. And I was, lucky enough to be using ambisonic microphones, so recording in 360 degrees. And I also took recordings of hidden sounds, and that's another area that's really important for me, a bit of a passion. So using hydrophones or contact microphones to pick up sounds that we can't hear with the naked ear. So those were the kind of explorations of that recording session, which I then took into the studio. And for me, writing that piece, I wanted to reflect the vastness, the emptiness of a space, and to really, really encourage people to listen in. And so it's an incredibly quiet piece. It moves at a very slow pace, and we hear the wind, and we hear the field recordings when they're revealed in the piece at a level that you'd hear them in real life, which means it's actually quite quiet. So the audience and the listeners, when they're listening in the space, have to really, become very, very conscious of not only what they're hearing, but themselves, because there's not much else there, and the people around them. And with this piece, I was lucky enough to be able to work in a big studio with 24 channels. So I was able to really explore depth, literally, and open out. So, really reflect that big open space that I was sitting in and recording. But all of this is framed within another musical context. So using some of those for this piece, it was fence recordings using contact microphones, and drawing out the pitches of those, and doing some slight, delicate manipulations onto those to give it a musical frame. And this is where my work often becomes harder to categorize, because it moves away from the very traditional acoustic, heavily gestural elements of traditional acoustic music. Yet it doesn't always sit in traditional soundscape music, because there is more intervention with the material, and it's a kind of hybrid between the two. But with both of those forms, and labeling genres can be a bit of a hindrance sometimes. Both of those forms, obviously, it all comes back to listening, and it's about being able to listen into sound and explore it that way. So those are some of the key important elements of my sort of concert work that have evolved over the years, and I think they've always been there. I've been bringing in recordings of places that I've visited into my work, so from day one, really, or been inspired by them. But then it was very much, you know, a fragmentary, you know, 3 seconds or 10 seconds revelation of something before moving back into the very, very abstract world. Whereas now I think I allow myself to you know, put a listener into that listening experience. And it, I guess, deep down, it's sharing that listening experience, sharing that meditative experience that I was, you know, lucky enough to be able to go and have in real life, and find and bringing that back into the concert hall or into an installation room. I think it's where I performed it with in Dieburg, and give the listener that space as well.
And I wanted to get to the, you know, this episode is being broadcast on July 18th. We're June 11th today, but it's going to be World Listening Day on that day. And our colleague Eric Leonardson, who also is the president of the World Forum for Acoustic Ecology, as he and others have pulled together this day every year celebrating Murray Schafer's birthday, but also an International Day of Listening. So this episode, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about listening, is dedicated to that World Listening Day event. And every day should be World Listening Day, but July 18th is a special day. What are your thoughts on the World Listening Day? Have you had much interaction with it? Or
I recognize it every year. I often have ambitions to be able to put an event on, and it's not always worked out.
You've done one now.
But I've done one now, yeah. But I, you know, I July the 18th is always in my calendar, because it's a day when everybody around the world just drops their tools and focuses, or it feels like that to me, focuses on listening. And it's a day when, you know, I feel I can turn to people, you know, who aren't part of our world, so to speak. I say, it's World Listening Day today. Have you heard this? Or why don't you go and sit on a bench for 5 minutes and just listen? And, you know, sharing the joy of listening with everybody. And, you know, I think that there's a lot to be said sometimes for having an official day, even though, you know, for most of us, every day is World Listening Day. But the fact that there are organised events and that there are ways to tune in and to share practice as well and see what other people are doing.
And the theme this year is the unquiet earth, you know, reflecting and engaging with the constant murmurs of the earth, as well as unheard sounds, you know. And there's a connection, I think, between your recalibration festival, the timing and the questions you've asked, and the unquiet earth, because the earth is more than murmuring. It's reeling, or maybe we're reeling, because I was talking to somebody recently who thinks, you know, the earth will be fine. It has tremendous resilience. We don't as much as a species, you know, and that brings us back to you know, to the sense of emergency and the role of artists. So you're a teacher, and you're an artist, and you're a curator. What do you see as some of the gaps and some of the opportunities for artists going forward in the climate emergency? I mean, we've already talked about it to a certain extent through the conversation here, but do you have any other thoughts on what people should keep in mind, or what are some of your aspirations in that regard?
Yeah, so you know, I think people need to keep talking about it and need to feel like, sometimes I don't feel that they feel always validated to be able to say this because they don't have enough knowledge. But I think one of the things that came out in our festival was the different responses that people were having to climate change, whether that was a very literal, this is how my world has changed due to things, this is a disappearing species, or this is my personal response. And so, you know, there are a lot of young people that are around me that are addressing this in so many different ways, whether it's through data sonification or through field recording related things, or that personal response. And I think that needs to carry on. But I think that there are opportunities as well where we need to look outside and see who can we work with to help make a difference. And that's, I guess that's an area of my practice that I'm doing quite a lot of at the moment, in terms of looking beyond. I've talked about my concert music, but looking beyond that, it's like, what direction can I take my work into to help spread a word or help influence where I go next. So I work with other people and then come back and think about, now what message can I send back into the concert hall, and what messages can I take out, and how can I just keep those messages alive until they become normalized in some way. And so I do work with community groups, and in terms of some of the sound walking work that I do, I've joining people across the university in different departments that so in geography and life sciences, I join seminar groups and talk with some of those communities there and share my practice, which when I do this, it makes a lot of sense to other people, but they're not normally exposed to listening and these kind of sonic practices. And it's amazing how they are received, and with such openness and support and, willingness for me to go and work with them more in whatever, form that may take. And in doing that, so I'm working with a climate change forest, a forest that's researching climate change, and I hope on World Listening Day I will be launching a stream from that forest, which will be really interesting, because it's an experimental forest where it's old oaks, but there's an experiment happening there. So actually, the sounds that are going to come back from that are not going to be quite as natural as we would expect, which is interesting. But this seems like an opportunity for me to be able to broaden my practice, to work with people working in climate research, and it's a no-brainer. And I haven't got, I'm not sure what direction that work's going to go in, but I'm excited to be able to feel like I'm part of something as well.
Well, I'm hearing excitement in your voice, because you're talking about collaboration, you're talking about intersectorality, you're talking about community engagement, you're talking about even regeneration, the idea that, because there are positive things happening in our world, and some of them can be transmitted through sound and art. I know in the UK there's a number of rewilding movements. Canada needs to, even though we have a large territory, we need to start thinking about that rewilding as a process, and whether you call it art or not, there's a process there, and there's a sound element. So the idea of bringing experiences to audiences that are both about awareness of the complexity, but also some of the positive work that's being done, that it moves us in a direction of sustainability, and even living in new ways, both new ways and old ways, because the status quo is untenable, right? The way we live, the excessive consumer society, it's untenable. It will stop at a certain point because we'll run out of resources. So before then, we need to reinvent the way we live, and we need to do it on the long term, thinking of many generations future, our children, their children, their children's children, as our people have done before. It's just that we're in a pickle right now. We've kind of put ourselves into a corner, and we don't see the way out. And when you talked about the young people being nervous and anxious about not knowing what to do, I can understand that. I am like that too. But there is a lot of power in arts and culture, power in the sense of ability to transcend some of the barriers, to find new ways around the issue that seems impossible, certainly uncertain, but sometimes it seems impossible. But art has a way.
C'est un peu comme quand on prend une grenouille qui est un animal à sang froid et qu'on la met dans un bocal d'eau et qu'on fait chauffer l'eau peu à peu. La grenouille va s'habituer à la
Composer Robert Normando.
Jusqu'à la mort.
It's a bit like taking a frog, which is a cold-blooded animal, and putting it into a jar of water and heating the water, little by little. The frog will get used to the temperature rising and rising, and it will not notice that the temperature has risen. And one day, the temperature will be too hot for it, and it will die. Therefore, our civilization, in terms of sound, looks a bit like that. That is to say, we get used to it, we get used to it, we get used to it, and at some point, we're going to have punctured eardrums.
I think it definitely does have a way. I think one of the things that came up in your workshop was that this provides some comfort to us as practitioners to know that we're working in these fields, and we can also hopefully see noticeable change in certain areas, but there is still such a long way to go because there's so much of society that isn't exposed to our work or the artist's work, and there's in the UK the arts are being devalued every day, and it's not. And there's so many struggles, personal struggles that other people are having. And I think one person talked about, societal differences and demographic differences. And actually, there's still huge sectors of society who are just struggling to survive themselves. So being able to invest their time and their energy into, even going to art or engaging with art or even considering the bigger issues at hand are quite well, they're just not on their radar for many, and understandably so. And so I feel we've got to keep doing what we're doing, and hope is important there, and hope that those who are in power, that somehow we can influence them. And I think sometimes it's knowing where to direct, where that change is going to come from, I think.
Well, I think that the curators, the producers, the educators have a lot of influence. When I saw that you chose to do gender parity on your festival, I thought, well, there's a statement, there's something within your control, and it changes everything. Because a lot more voices are being heard that might not have been heard. So if you can do that, if we can do that, what else can we do in the way that we approach, the way we present, we produce? These podcasts have tremendous. I listen to podcasts a lot because I'm walking. These ideas enter my brain and then they don't leave. It's like an artwork. They affect you. They touch you. They bring you somewhere. So there is that potential there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've listened to a few of your podcasts when I've been running now, Claude, and it's they're wonderful because more and more people are listening to podcasts, and they have a huge effect on people, which is really, really good.
Annie Mahtani, is there anything else that you would like to say that we haven't talked about that might be important to tag on here at the end?
Yeah, I guess. What you said about the importance of gender parity in our festival and the messages that it sends out, I think that comes back to another thing that I've been talking quite a lot about in my own practice, and and we've been talking about artists and individuals, but I'm part of a bigger institution, and as part of a university in the UK, I think that's a tool that I can use. And so, for example, being able to say that we at the University of Birmingham are only doing festivals where there is gender parity and there are a clear diversity agenda that we are that we're working to, we can help to lead the way with that. And I think that's really important. I think we need to be brave. We need to take big steps and do what we know is right. But with the power of an institution like a university, you can take bigger steps than, and not lose if it doesn't go quite right. So I think there's a huge responsibility for me in the position that I'm lucky enough to be in, and for other people in these positions to do that. And once you see somebody doing it, you realize that it can be done, and actually, if you don't follow suit, you're going to be picked up on it. And I think there's another thing that does give me hope, is that actually, you just need a few people to lead the way, and hopefully, others will follow.
We'll talk again, Annie. I'm sure our paths will cross again. And thank you for sharing your experience and of not just the festival, but the workshop and your practice. It's been a lot of fun.
No, thank you, Claude. It's been lovely to talk to you.